All right, welcome back. This is going to be macroeconomics, chapter 9 on inflation. So if you want to pull out the notes I've provided after you've read the chapter, we'll get started. This one will be a pretty short one. Inflation, honestly, is not all that important in modern times, especially in developed economies. So we're going to talk about what it is, how it's tracked, data quantification, all that sort of stuff. But we're really not going to spend a whole lot of time on this chapter because a lot of economists are starting to even say, like, inflation doesn't matter. Inflation doesn't even happen anymore in the developed world. So, pretty interesting stuff. Anyway, all right. I'll give you a second to kind of pull out those notes, pause me, and then we'll jump in. Okay. So, what is inflation? Inflation is just a general and ongoing rise in prices in the economy. A little bit of inflation is nearly inevitable, healthy, it's no real surprise. Economists generally suggest you run inflation around, 1.5%, 2%, especially for a developed economy. I thought this was a fun quote. This sort of explains what's going on here, right? At the beginning of 2017, a single dollar had the same purchasing power as 18 cents in 1972. So 18 cents was the equivalent of today's $1. They had the exact same purchasing power. And because of inflation is why that $1, that 18 cents over that span of time, which is what, 45 years, over those 45 years, 18 cents has become $1, basically. Let's see, how do we measure inflation? Inflation is measured through what's called a basket of goods. It's generally about 200 subcategories, inclusive of anywhere from like 80,000 to 100,000 products that I've seen looking through this in the past. What they'll do is they will use surveys to survey around 7,000 or 8,000 households in America to try to find what does the average family of four buy in a year. Okay, and then they take all of those goods and they go to or call the stores around those 7,000 households, and they go there or they call the management and they ask how much was a 24-ounce box of Lucky Charms, and they'll ask every single one of those, like 27 those thousands and thousands of stores. They'll ask all of them, how much was a 24-ounce box of Lucky Charms, like all over the country, right? In numerous different types of stores, sizes of stores, based on the 7,000 households that they've surveyed. And they'll take about 80 to 100,000 products, like I said, and they'll call all of these stores all across America and try to determine, what is the price of this quote unquote basket of goods this year compared with last year, compared with the year before, right? And to try to determine how are prices being affected over time, right? Are prices rising on the average family's purchases, or are prices declining? Generally, it's rising, right? We don't get a lot of deflation. If you get deflation, you're in trouble, or if you get hyperinflation, you're in trouble. We'll talk about both of those. So the Consumer Price Index, which I was talking about, is from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, much like the variables that we were talking about in the last chapter, right? Bureau of Labor and Statistics is really vital to a lot of this stuff: inflation, unemployment, poverty rates, all kinds of stuff. Again, it's based on a family of four. Keep in mind that it takes like 5 to 10 years. It sort of lags behind today's technology. They're trying to figure out ways to speed this up, and so that gap is shrinking over time. But there is there is a lag, right? It took them about 5 years to put cell phones in the basket of goods, and there were 40 million cell phone owners at that point. So remember that there's a bit of a lag. It takes a lot of time to update all these things, right? 100,000 goods is a lot of stuff. Um, and then you got to call and you got to build it all out in your database, and so it just takes time. They use what's called the Consumer Expenditure Survey, the CES, and this is that survey of about 7,000 households. 80 to 100,000 different products are tracked. You have about 200 subgroups in 8 major groups, right? And the major groups are food, housing, apparel, transportation, medical services, recreation, education, and then other. And other is like, cigarettes and tobacco products, probably the weirder fringe stuff, stuff that can't really fit into the other 7 categories, right? So if you look down here at section 9.2, how to measure changes in the cost of living, I just sort of wanted to show you how this breakdown comes out. And you'll notice that housing makes up the vast majority not the majority, the vast plurality of these subcategories, right? At about 43%. Some people are running 50 to 60% of their total income is spent on housing. I've seen in some major urban areas, especially in sort of like the hot spots like California. If you want to live in San Francisco or Los Angeles, like you're paying a lot of your money towards housing. Seattle's pretty bad from what I hear. And we're also in the midst of sort of a housing, what's the opposite of glut? We're in the nadir of housing, right? There's a severe need for housing. There's a lot of demand, not very much supply, and so the owners are able to drive up housing costs, right? And so it's taking up a larger and larger proportion of the American paycheck. And here in 2017, it was about 43%, and from some of the data I've seen recently, it's been at like 48 to 51%. So it's rising, especially during the pandemic. And part of that is homelessness, and I mean not homelessness, but unemployment, things like that, right? As wages disappear, but housing costs remain, there's going to be a gap, right? That's going to bring down that average and push them closer to each other. Okay, we're going to move on to a couple of other, like, more experimental new stabs at measuring inflation and this type of concept, and then we'll move on to sort of some broader trends over time and comparatively across nations, and then we'll end this one. That's going to be pretty short. So, okay, the core inflation rate is a really important one, and it's the one that the Fed and the Treasury follow more than the CPI, more than just the regular inflation rate statistics. And this is because the inflation rate statistics, the full inflation rate, basically, is inclusive of a lot of products that they fluctuate a lot, right? Like gas prices or electricity prices or food prices, right? Things happen in the market. Hurricane Katrina, or even like the recent Texas freeze, basically shut down a third to half of all of the United States fuel refinery capability, right? And so gas prices we've seen have sort of shot up. We saw the same thing during the Katrina hurricane when it hit Houston, where a lot of our refinery capabilities are in the United States. A huge proportion of our refining capability. When those things go down, it affects gas prices instantly, right? Or say there's a drought suddenly, or this year is just a particularly bad year for like locusts, and suddenly, millions of acres of crops either just don't grow or are destroyed. It's going to affect food prices almost immediately, and it can be pretty devastating on food prices. I don't remember. I don't know if y'all remember what was called lime-pocalypse a few years ago, where they were having trouble with their lime yields in Mexico, and they were having trouble getting them across the border into America, and lime prices just shot through the roof. Right, the core inflation rate will take that sort of stuff into consideration, and it will drop it out of the statistics. And so you get a much more sort of even-keeled inflation rate that is a longer time period, rather than taking into account these like extreme fluctuations that are real, but they don't really reflect the reality of the long-term health of the economy, right? Which is why they're dropping it out. So this core inflation rate pulls out the extreme vicissitudes of some products, and it leads to a much flatter and longer term inflation rate. And so this is why economists tend to like that one a lot better, because it gives you a better idea of the health of the economy, rather than these sort of jumping numbers because of extreme conditions, or some extreme weather condition, or a plague of locusts or something, right? Okay, so moving on. There are some new, more experimental measures of inflation. I really like the producer price index, because it kind of tells you the health of your producing side of your economy, whereas the inflation rate and the CPI and the core inflation are all based on a basket of goods that the average family of four buys. That doesn't necessarily tell you like how your supplier side of the economy is doing. And so this producer price index, the PPI, which a lot of economists also like and they use in their research and their statistical models, is a really nice measure of the other side of the economy, sort of the business side of the economy, and it's based on the prices of supplies and input. To make finished goods, right, or services, or whatever it is. And so it's a nice different way of measuring it. And the hope is, right, that all of these measures sort of match up, and that they're all sort of measuring the same conditions in the economy. And when they start to diverge, that's when you need to go, wait, what's happening? Why is the average family of four doing okay, but producers aren't? And we're seeing high inflation on the producer side, or vice versa. You know, producers are doing great, like the people with money are doing awesome, but the average family of four is really struggling, and their prices are rising, quickly. Why is this happening? What can we do to help to solve the problem, right? That's the government and the Treasury and the Fed. That's sort of their role, because the economy is so vast, right? No individual, no even single state or actor could really affect it in massive ways, whereas the government can. So. Okay, so that was the producer price index. Next we have the international price index, and this is based on prices for imports and exports. This one's tricky, right? Because we have a lot of laws, like Donald Trump put in a lot of tariffs on Chinese goods, which are going to affect pricing, and they retaliated by putting tariffs on our goods. And now we're getting our allies to help tariff China, and vice versa. And so it starts to get really messy, and it doesn't necessarily reflect the real economy. It can be a lot of times a function of these sanctions and tariffs, and so I would say just be careful with this one. I don't necessarily like it a lot, because there are a lot of things that are affecting it that aren't just economics, right? There's a lot of politics involved. The next one, employment cost index. This is just a measure of wage inflation, right? Are wages going up? Are wages going down? Are they stable? This sort of thing, especially compared with the price index. If wages inflation is staying the same and wages aren't rising, but prices are, you're starting to get a gap that affects people, right? And the standard of living is now dropping, and you got to worry about this sort of thing too. Ba, 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 ba. Okay, last, the GDP deflator. This one is a really nice measure because it's probably the most inclusive measure of all of these that we've discussed. It really sort of takes all of the different aspects of the economy into consideration, because it takes all of that GDP. You remember when we put together our GDP equation, right? GDP equals, and it's going to be your government expenditures, your consumption, your investment, and then your imports minus exports. Exports minus imports. You add all those things up and you get GDP. Well, this takes the inflation for each of those categories into consideration and builds a GDP deflator, and says, well, our GDP actually was only this much compared to last year when we take all this inflation into consideration. All right, and those are all of the sort of the newer, maybe the last 15 to 25 years. The GDP deflator's been around for a while, but the PPI and the IPI and these sort of measures, some of them are really new, like within the last 10 or 15 years, where we've just started to understand and had the capability of running such massive algorithms and such huge data sets in computers. So pretty cool stuff, and it'll be really interesting to watch where do economists start to settle on which one's the best measure, what new measures will come out of our studies of these measures and how they compare to others. I love that sort of stuff. I like statistics and how we measure things and how we do science, basically. So, okay, last subsection, how the U.S. and other countries experience inflation. Here in figure 9.3, you can see America's inflation experience over time, right? It was incredibly devastating, and you were getting these enormous swings in the early 1900s, right? The early 20th century, before Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, before sort of the standard scientific practices of economics were sort of getting settled. We didn't really know how to control currency or inflation or prices, especially when you're getting things like the Great Depression, and you're getting these massive world wars where one of the big problems is that you'd get huge inflation as soon as a war was over, because all of these men would come back into the economy and demand would suddenly explode, right? Because now you've got women in the economy, all of these millions of men, and all of their sort of the private side of armies, where all of the logistics and supply side and all that kind of stuff, all of these guys are coming home, and there's an enormous demand in the market, right? Because now they have money to spend, and they're not away at war. And the suppliers are having to transition from building war products to building, everyday, it's called the butter versus guns, right? We were building guns, now we need to produce butter. We haven't transitioned yet, and we can't really produce, and now demand is exploding. So supply is really low already and restricted. Demand has just exploded. Prices for these goods that do exist on the market just skyrocket, right? And so until the equilibrium is reached where all of these producers can adjust from guns to butter, you get extraordinary inflation post-war. And so the U.S. government, and especially, the European governments had problems with this, because not only did they have the problem I just described in a functioning economy, which was America, everything, all of their factories had been bombed out and shelled out. I mean, they weren't producing jack crap, like nothing. And so you can imagine what a good cost in a country like that, where like I literally need some butter to make some dinner, and I'll fist fight you for it, right? I'll bring $6,000 and pay you for that friggin' butter because I gotta have it. My family's starving. I can't find butter anywhere. So it can become a real problem post-war. Okay, because like I said, the producers haven't transitioned, the producers that even exist, and all of these new young men are coming home and building families, and demand is skyrocketing, and it can become a serious issue. Finally, oh, excuse me, I didn't finish. That was just like the early part of the graph. I also wanted you to note the later part of the graph. From about 1985, which is the Reagan administration, and Paul Volcker is the Treasury Secretary, who's a big hero of mine because he did the hard thing and raised interest rates, even though like people hated him forever, but he sort of saved our economy. Paul Volcker is in. He saves our economy. Alan Greenspan comes in the 90s, and then you get Bernanke and others, and Janet Yellen today. But I guess the point here is that you'll note that inflation is almost non-existent now. For the last 35, 40 years, basically since the early 1980s, inflation has not been a problem in any developed country. And there are a lot of economists now who are saying, just like, stop, why are we even talking about inflation? This is not a thing anymore. I don't know if that's true, right? You should be a little nervous because it was a thing for 100 years, and it was a big part of all of the economic calculations that were made for 100 years. But it seems like in the modern technological, fast-paced society where information is translating about prices and demand and supply nearly instantaneously, inflation doesn't exist anymore. And this is a really interesting argument that economists are making today about, look, the United States needs to be borrowing, and all of these countries across the planet basically need to be borrowing as much money as they can right now and pumping it into the system, through infrastructure projects, through unemployment payments, through however you can get it into the system. Sort of the FDR New Deal philosophy, right? Because if you spend that, say, $2 trillion like Biden's talking about, if you spend that $2 trillion today, it's literally going to cost you less money in the long run because of the almost non-existent inflation rate. So it's a really interesting argument. And a lot of economists say, look, nothing is going to happen. It is cheaper to just borrow the money and pump it into the system because it's basically free money. You will only have to pay $1.8 billion back in today's dollars on the $2 trillion you borrowed. So you're actually going to save money, and you'll save the economy, and you'll ensure that, millions don't go unemployed, and that millions of small shops don't shut down, and that we're sort of stuck in limbo if that happens and we have to sort of rebuild it up from scratch. That's the worry that a lot of these economists say, like, if we lose it, and it's going to take years to get it back, so dump it into the system now. And I think it's a good argument. From what I've seen and what I've read, we'll see what happens. The very last graph I want to show you is 9.4, and the only thing to really note here is that the developed economies track each other. There's so much interconnectedness in the modern economy and globalization with all of this stuff that inflation tracks nearly identically in every country in the developed world. I would call it like the OECD, right? The rich world group of nations. Once you start getting down to the second and the third world sort of tiers, they have different inflation rates. They have different inflation trends. They generally have much higher inflation than in America. It usually runs on average at about 10 to 12%. But a lot of this is because their economies are burning so hot, right? They're also growing at 10 to 12%. So prices fluctuate quickly. But in the modern economy, in developed world, inflations are nearly non-existent, and they track across the world almost exactly the same. So the argument is all of these countries should be borrowing money and dumping into the system now because it'll actually be cheaper in the long run and will keep our economy from breaking down. So that's it. Pretty short chapter. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you're all healthy and happy, and stay safe, and I'll see you soon.